It's my job as part of this service now, my role to share something from the Bible, to share something from what we as Christians believe is God speaking to us through what he has had written thousands of years ago. What we believe he has written through human people, inspired by him, that is timeless, that always has something in it for us to learn from. And over this summer, I'm aware that over the summer various people are away on holidays, and it might be that you're visiting this morning. We've been looking at what it means to be wise people. We've been looking at a book in the Bible called Proverbs, which was written by a very wise man, and there are some Bibles coming around if you want to be able to follow along in a paper copy. We've been looking at this book written by a guy called Solomon, who was one of the kings in Israel. Very, very wise man, someone who knew what it was to live life well. Often didn't do it, but he knew what it was. And at his very best, he was a deeply wise man, knowing and living the way that God would want. We've been looking at what it means to live well, and we've been thinking about what that means for our friendships and our relationships, for our words, the way that we speak, for how we spend our time, for the choices that we make. And we're finishing that this evening. We took a sort of semi-break from that last week to think about prayer, because there was something that we believed that God was really saying to us through prayer. If you weren't here and if you haven't had a chance to listen to that, then do go onto our website and have a listen if you're part of our church family, because we think that was an important thing that God was wanting to say to us. But we're coming back to sort of finish that series off by looking at something that we see come up again and again and again through the book of Proverbs. And it's to do with the difference between someone who is lazy and someone who is not. Someone who is living their life on purpose and deliberately and seeking to do the things that God is calling them to, and people who are just kind of idling away and getting on through and waiting for whatever's going to come next. A sort of active, deliberate approach to life, or a passive, sitting on the back foot approach to life. It comes up again and again and again through the book of Proverbs in lots of different ways. And we're going to be asking what it means to be people who are wise and truly alive, living our lives knowing that they count and making sure they count. I want to start by asking you a question before we turn to the first of three little proverbs I'm going to look at. And it's this: when was the last time you were properly, and I mean properly, lazy? For me, it happens quite often. Every so often I have one of those days where I just do nothing. I might at some point change out of my pajamas. I might not. It's anyone's guess. I don't do it every day. If I did it every day, that would say there was something wrong with me, that I'm just a deeply lazy person. But every so often, I don't see anything wrong with us just taking a chance to rest and to chill and to relax and to just be. And throughout this message this morning, I'm going to be talking about what it means to people who are living life on purpose. What I don't want anyone to hear is that every moment of every day we have to be actively doing, making achievements, getting things done. That is not true. We're built to be people who rest. We're built to be people who need rest, who need to build rhythm into our life where we rest and we work, where we work and we rest. Holidays are good. Time off is good. Every so often having a day where we achieve absolutely nothing is a great thing. The question is, what about the days when we're not achieving absolutely nothing? And are we making the most of them? So I just wanted to put that a little bit in context. The first proverb that I want to look at actually says something quite similar to that. It's in Proverbs chapter 10. And for anyone who's not familiar with the book of Proverbs, who's not looked into it before, it's not the kind of book that's very easy to read from beginning to end. It's like reading a book that says, a stitch in time saves 9. Too many cooks spoil the broth. And just endlessly going on with phrases that are not necessarily related one to the next, but are just lots of little bits of advice. So it's hard to read from beginning to end, but instead I'm going to pick out 3 proverbs from a few different places in it that all speak about this idea of living life well and on purpose. The first is in Proverbs chapter 10 and verse 5. And it says this: "He who gathers crops in summer is a prudent son, but he who sleeps during harvest is a disgraceful son." Fairly simple image. We've got this idea of someone who is a farmer, someone who is working the land and has a son, and the son has the choice when it comes to the summer, when it comes to harvest time: am I going to go out and gather crops, or am I going to sleep through the harvest and be not much good to anyone? Really simple image, and it's basically saying, look, when there's work to be done, if we're stepping up to it, if we're going to it, that's wise, that's prudent, that's a good idea. If there's work to be done and we shy away from it, that's not a good thing. It's a really simple image that translates well across all kinds of different cultures. But I want to point something out here, because there is a difference between modern day Western farming and the farming that this would have been talking about then. If you go to a farm in the UK now, they are incredibly efficient places where all year round there is something going on. You've got the time when all of the crops are being sown and it's all the ground is being tilled and prepared, and then it's being sown. And then you've got the harvest time a few months later. But those aren't the only two times in the year for a farm these days. Because in between that, farms structure themselves so that every bit of land is being used as optimally as possible. So you might have different crops in different fields with different growth cycles so that you can have multiple sowing seasons and multiple reaping seasons. You might have a farm shop, or you might have animals that are working in different parts of the field that have, in different parts of the farm, that are being, you need to do different stuff with them. I'm not a farmer, I don't know exactly what I'm talking about. But you might have the farmer's market going on. I'm sure a lot of us have been to those. You might have attractions going on for children who can come and pet the animals or go around mazes and do different things. There's no real dead time in farming now. There was then. When Solomon was writing this, farming was a kind of twice a year thing. Lots to be done during those times, and a bit of time getting the ground ready to be sown into. But there were long periods of the time when actually there wasn't a lot to do. There's lots of waiting for when the harvest will come, preparing yourself to be ready to do the harvest rather than preparing the harvest that's going to come. And so when we read this passage with a sort of modern farming lens, we could very quickly think we've always got to be doing something because it's always harvest time. Back when this was written, it wasn't always harvest time. There were times to rest, there were times to wait, there were times to pause. But the question really is, when it is time to reap the harvest, when it is time to step up and work, when there is a task to be done, are we people who step up and do it? Or are we people who go, you know what, someone else can do that? It's a really simple principle. It's a really simple principle for all of us to take on board. But think about the life of Jesus. Jesus spent 30 years growing as a carpenter and learning his father's trade and being a fairly ordinary human being because the time wasn't quite right yet. And then about age 30, he stepped into the plans that God had in a big way and spent 3 years reaping that harvest and 3 years working and moving and traveling and teaching and healing and doing all the things that he'd done. Each of us in our life, we have different times and different seasons. I don't think we can compare ourselves to the person sitting next to us and going, well, they seem to be getting an awful lot done with Jesus, and I don't. It might be that it's time for you to rest, but it might not be. It might be that God is saying at the beginning of this new academic year, which I know doesn't affect everyone, but affects a lot of us in one way or another, it's time to step up again. It's harvest time. There's work to be done. The question is, are we up to it? Are we up for it? I want to look at another little passage, a few chapters later, in Proverbs chapter 14. And this one, I'll be honest, can be a little bit of a kick in the gut for me and people like me. It says this in Proverbs 14:23, all hard work brings a profit, but mere talk leads only to poverty. All hard work leads to profit, but mere talk leads only to poverty. Put another way, talk is cheap and actions speak far louder. How often can we get carried away with a new idea or a new thing and talking about something till the cows come home, but never actually getting on and doing it? Imagine going back to our farming image. It's harvest time and all the workers are out in the harvest field. And the person who's leading the team, the person who's in charge of all the work that's going on is explaining all the tasks that need to be done, giving people advice and tips and wisdom. And there's someone stood there listening and going, this guy knows his stuff. I really want to listen to this. This guy's a really good harvest reaper and I want to be too. So I'm going to take notes. I'm going to get my notebook out. I'm going to make sure I know exactly what I need to do. And actually, you know what? I'm going to spend all day doing that. I'm going to spend all day listening and knowing exactly how I should be doing it. I'm going to become the best theoretical harvest reaper in the world. But unless you're actually getting your hands dirty and pulling some vegetables up or whatever it is, you're not actually being much use. Talk is cheap. Just talking about stuff and not doing it doesn't get anything done. I say this can be a bit of a kick in the gut for people like me. Why? Well, it will come as no surprise to you. I love to talk. I really enjoy having a conversation or explaining stuff or talking about stuff or reading and filling my own mind with new ideas and new things. And it can be really tempting for me just to sit and do that and not actually get out there and do anything useful with my life. I know that's a challenge for me. I'm sure it's a challenge for others of us as well. Flip side to talk being cheap is this. Just listening is cheap. Just hearing stuff and not doing anything with it doesn't get anything done. Doesn't achieve anything. We believe that God speaks to us. I believe that God speaks to us primarily through the Bible, through his word. When I read it, am I listening so that I can do something with it? Or am I listening because I want to listen to a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more? What are we doing with the things that we've heard? There's far more to the Christian life than coming to church and being involved in something like this and listening to preaching. There's far, far more to it than that. But let's focus in on that a little bit for a minute. Many of you, most of you in this room will regularly do exactly what you're doing now and be part of a gathered worship community where we seek God together and where we listen to him through his word and where someone like me will come and try and unpack and explain and apply it to our lives. That's quite a common experience for us. So think about your last year. For those of you who that's a regular part of the rhythm of your life, think about your last year. What's changed? Have you changed? Is anything different about your life? Have you started doing new things? Have you put new practices into your life? Has it changed the way that you've engaged in your thinking and therefore in the way that you relate to people? Are there things that you've done because you've been challenged to do? Or is actually life pretty much the same? You've enjoyed the teaching, you've enjoyed the sermons, you've enjoyed coming and doing this, but it hasn't really necessarily impacted your life. If that's the case for you, I think you've probably got one of two options. Either find somewhere where you're going to be taught better, because there's a chance that could be our fault. Or ask yourself the question, is this because I'm just listening without a heart to do and to change? There's a verse in the New Testament that says, don't just be hearers of the word and so fool yourself. Instead, be doers of the word. It's a challenge for all of us. Talk can be cheap. Listening can be cheap. There are times when we need to get out there and do something. We need to get on our knees and pray because we've been called to. We need to go and have a conversation with a friend. We need to pick up the phone and say, I'm sorry. We need to do something because God has called us to do it. Can be a challenge to me. I'm sure it can be a challenge to all of us. And the final verse that I want to have a little look at is a few chapters later on. In Proverbs 19 and verse 15, we read this. Laziness brings on deep sleep, and the shiftless go hungry. Laziness brings on deep sleep. Sleep is good. Rest is good. We need it. It's healthy. It's helpful. The phrase for deep sleep here is almost a sleep out of which it's very hard to wake up. The kind of thing where almost our muscles, our physical muscles and our mental muscles and our spiritual muscles have atrophied to the point where they're just really not that useful anymore. We've got so used to inaction that it's really hard to stir ourselves up to action. We've got so used to sitting back that it's hard to step forwards. It can be in the case of habits that we end up adopting. Habits are just things that we do over and over and over again. The things that we want to do over and over again and the things that we don't want to do over and over again. The way that habits are formed is like this. We do something once, then we do it again, and those couple of times it's pretty harmless. It hasn't really become who we are. But then we do it a few more times and we kind of learn to live with it. And then it becomes normal and then it just becomes part of who we are. And at that point it's really hard to break away from it. And if we're used to having quite a passive approach to our life, if we're used to being a little bit lazy and not really applying ourselves and pushing ourselves a little bit, or letting God stir us up and lead us in a new direction, it can be hard to step up and move forward. Here's something for me that I'm realizing is a bad habit for me, and ongoingly it's been something that if I'm not active and deliberate in, I'll just fall back into. I spend most of my time with Christians, and I love you. But that's not the point of my life. I believe that all of us need to be sharing Jesus with people who don't know him. You might be here today and you don't know who Jesus is. Let me tell you. We believe that he's the Son of God. We believe that he is God come to earth because God loves us enough to show himself to us and then to die in my place, to die in our place because he recognizes what we all know is that there's something broken about us. And so he takes our brokenness on himself and he dies in our place, and in rising again, he gives us completely new life. That's who Jesus is. That's the message each of us has to share. But if I'm only sharing that with people who already know it, I'm not being much use. It kind of becomes a little bit cheap, that talk. So I recognize that an occupational hazard of mine, because I work for a church, is that I spend a lot of time with Christians. And that's good, but I need to be very deliberate and active in making sure that I get up off my sofa and spend time with people who are not already Christians. That's one of the things for me that I have to constantly challenge about on myself, because I can become in that sort of deep sleep, in that kind of habit, in that kind of way of life. Each of us needs to ask what that is for us. We need to ask, what does it mean for me to take a step forward? What does it mean for me to wake myself up a little bit more? It might be that actually you are gung-ho, on fire, pursuing everything that God is asking you to do. Keep on going. I know for a lot of us, we'll look at our lives and go, I think there might be another thing. There might be another step. You've only got a certain amount of time. I don't know how much time that is, but we've only got a finite amount of time to be doing the things that God's asked us to do. And I don't want to waste that time. My dad he's a minister as well. And he's at the stage now where he's nearing retirement. He's still got a chunk of time left. It's not like he's going to be retiring next year or anything, but that is very much in sight. And in the way, when I talk with him and when I look at him, I can hear very clearly that, he knows that he's got a certain window in which to be doing this still as part of his working life. And he wants to make those years really count. It'd be really easy for me, looking at being a chunk younger than my dad, obviously, to look and go, I've got loads of time. The next couple of years, I can kind of just have a little bit of time off. I don't need to really apply myself. I can have a few sort of fallow years during that time. I don't want to do that. I want to pursue every single thing I've got. And I'm not just talking about people who work for a church. This is all of us. We all have things that God is asking us to do. So I guess my questions are, do you know what they are? Do you know what it is that God wants you to do? And then are you willing to not sleep through those harvests, to do more than just talk about it, and to make sure that you don't end up falling asleep and becoming apathetic or lazy or ineffective? Sometimes we all need a little bit of a kick. We all need a little bit of an encouragement to get up and to do something, to take a next step. We've heard already about the Alpha course. Who is it that maybe you've thought every time you've heard that announcement that you might invite, or someone who they might benefit from something like that, but you've never quite got there and done it? Well, put some time in your diary. Put some time in your calendar to spend some time praying for that person. Do something about it. And then make sure that you intentionally invite them for a coffee or invite them for a pint or invite them round for a meal and say, do you know what? There's this thing that's really important in my life and I'd love to help you explore it. And there's this thing, and explain what Alpha is. If you're not sure what Alpha is and you don't know exactly how it works, come talk to someone. Come talk to someone who can help you understand how it works so that you can honestly represent it to other people. But make a step, do something. Might be that that's not what God is asking you to do, but there's someone who you know who actually you just need to go and spend some time with. I mentioned this last week, but Jesus, speaking of harvests and farming so much this week, there's a time when Jesus, in the New Testament of the Bible, he's talking to his disciples and he says, the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. So pray that God would raise up and send out more workers into the harvest. He's saying there's a whole world that needs to know about God, but there's not enough people to tell them. So pray that God would send more people, and that the people who are told and believe would then go out and tell others that they might believe. You could start there. You could start by praying. Start by asking God to raise up you and others to be doing that. There's another verse in the New Testament, in a letter written by one of the early church leaders. It's in a book called Colossians, that says this: whatever you do, do it as for the Lord. Whatever it is that you are doing with your life, do it for God. Don't just do it for your boss, or for your wife, or your husband, or your kids, or your parents. Don't do it for anyone else other than God. If there's something in your life that you absolutely couldn't be doing as a way of serving God, it's probably not something you should be doing. But if you can be doing it for God, then do it for him. Be the very, very best in your field, or the very most diligent person in your office or in your classroom. Be the very most committed to the people that you're meant to be serving. Be the person who cares most for the needs of your clients. Why? Because God cares for your clients. Because God cares for the pupils in your classroom. Because God cares for your patients. Serve them because you are serving God. Do everything with an attitude that says, God, this is my act of worship. That is not a passive life. That is a life that is actively pursuing God's purpose in everything. So take stock, spend a bit of time, maybe this afternoon, looking through what you're going to be doing over the next week, over the next month, and praying into it and saying, God, in these places, use me. Where I'm going to be, send me. We've done it this morning for a small section of us, those involved in education or with children and young people. But that applies for all of us. There's somewhere that you're going to spend more time this week than anywhere else. Pray that God would make you useful there and effective there. We need a heart that says, I'm going where God is taking me. I'm alive and I'm going to make it count. So I'm going to pray that each of us would have that heart and have that attitude, that we would each be pulled back and led on by God into the places that he's putting us. Father God, thank you that you do have plans and purposes for us. Thank you that while I might look at it and think you could be far more effective without me, you love to work through us. You love to work with us. So God, I pray that you would be prompting and nudging us. Help us all when there are things to be done, to do them. Not about adding another thing to our diary or another task or another job, but taking the things that we are doing, the things that you've called us to, the situations you've placed us in, and help us to be active there. To invite you to be part of those worlds and part of those activities. Help us not just to talk about you. Help us not just to talk about what it might mean to take another step with you, but help us to do it. And if we're not sure what that might be, Lord, would you help us to seek out people who might be able to lead us to that? Help us to be accountable to one another. Help us to spur one another on. And Lord, help us not to fall asleep. And for the parts of my life where I have, the parts of my life where I've neglected you or I've neglected something, I ask by the power of your Spirit, would you wake us up? Reminded of that image from The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe of Aslan waking up the people who've turned to stone, breathing on them. And these people who've been caught and stuck and dead are brought back to life. And I pray that for the parts of this church family that are like a sleeping giant, I pray that you would wake us up, that you would breathe on us by your Spirit, and that as you fill us afresh, as you fill us with your very self, that you would enliven us, that you would remind us and encourage us that we can do things with you, that we are able in your strength to do incredible things. Lord, lead us to them. Inspire us. Wake us up and guide us, I pray. In Jesus' name, amen.